Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to Leo Baeck Institute and the Center for Jewish History. My name is David Brown. I'm Director of Programs and Communications for Leo Baeck Institute. And again, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to try and be super brief, as I'm very eager to hear the discussion tonight, but there's a little bit of housekeeping to do up front. First, I know that there are many regulars among the audience, but for those of you who are here for the first time in this building or here at a Leo Baeck Institute event for the first time, I just want to explain briefly what we're all about. The Leo Baeck Institute is a research library and archive dedicated to the history of German-speaking Jews. We were founded in 1955 by emigre intellectuals who were determined to document and preserve the vibrant heritage that had been nearly destroyed. And here in New York, what we do to fulfill that mission in particular is we have 80,000 books in our library collection, archives primarily of German Jewish refugees, but also German Jewish immigrants to the United States even from the 19th century that encompass about 5 million pages of correspondence, vital documents, and the like. And we have an 8,000 item art collection, and all of which are used by scholars and students around the globe. And people who come here to use our resources, they do so in this great building, the Center for Jewish History. And we feel very fortunate to be here because when people come and use our materials, they are able to view them in the context of the larger sort of global context of Jewish history alongside the collections of our partners, which I'll acknowledge briefly: YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, and Yeshiva University Museum. I also want to acknowledge our partner in tonight's program, Deutsches Haus at NYU. I encourage you to check out their very stimulating public programming, and if you're really inspired tonight and you want to read the Frankfurt School in German, you can take some of their great language courses. And I want to thank, in particular, the executive director of Deutsches Haus at NYU, Julianne Camfield, and program coordinator Sarah Gerner for their contribution to making tonight possible. One other thing, you'll notice on the back of your programs there are 7 events listed. We're actually in the 6th event of a 7-event series where we're examining German Jewish history through the lens of contemporary questions. And it's been a fantastic series, and you have one more chance tomorrow night to see the final event, which will be a discussion of the Pew Research Center's study on a portrait of Jewish Americans, sort of demography and sociological study of the Jewish population in the United States. And our panelists will look at that and posit what the responses might have been like had it been administered 100 years ago in Germany, and look at sort of parallels and contrasts. So I encourage you to join us tomorrow night if you can. It's going to be excellent. Now tonight, we're going to talk about sort of the most contemporary of contemporary issues, which, depending on your perspective, you might find it very animating or completely enervating. You might find it completely frightening, or you might be among that segment that finds it exhilarating somehow. And I think it's something that a lot of us, or maybe I speak only for myself, sort of feel like we understand in our guts, but it's very difficult to think about analytically and to find the right words to understand this. And fortunately, we have a panel of very distinguished scholars who are going to discuss how a group of German Jewish thinkers analyzed some very similar phenomena and personalities, not just in their troubled home country, but right here in the United States. And like I said, I'm very eager to hear from them, so I'm only going to give the briefest of introductions and just an overview of the order that we're going to hear from them in. First, we're going to hear from Jack Jacobs, who teaches at CUNY and is an outstanding scholar of left-wing intellectual history and its intersections with Jewish history. He'll give an overview of the Frankfurt School's analysis of anti-Semitism, which was central to their analysis of fascism, and he's also going to offer us some ideas about how that same analysis can shed some light on contemporary racism. Second, we're going to hear from Jonathon Catlin, a PhD candidate in history at Princeton University, who's going to talk about the Frankfurt School's sociological field studies in the United States in the post-war, during the war and after the war, especially the books The Authoritarian Personality and Prophets of Deceit, which examined some authoritarian tendencies in the American public, as well as the sort of tactics and phenomena of various demagogues from the first half of the 20th century. Then we'll hear from Liliane Weissberg, a distinguished scholar of comparative literature and German at the University of Pennsylvania, who's going to cover the Frankfurt School's critique of what they called the culture industry, and how their insights about mass culture and the culture industry can apply to an era of reality TV politics. So then we're going to get into a discussion which will be led by Anson Rabinbach, an intellectual and cultural historian from Princeton, who will lead a discussion among the panelists and then open things up to you. So I again thank our panelists so much, and we're going to hear first from Jack Jacobs.
My thanks to the Leo Baeck Institute for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate in it. In the 1940s and later, the most important theorists of the Frankfurt School, including Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, devoted sustained attention to the study of anti-Semitism. They developed a multifaceted analysis designed not only to explicate the meaning of anti-Semitism itself, but also to underscore the ways in which totalitarian anti-Semitism sheds light on the direction of society, the reversion, as they once wrote, of enlightened civilization to barbarism. It's by no means my intent in my remarks tonight to present a comprehensive summary of the Frankfurt School's approach to hatred of Jewry, nothing of the kind. I intend merely to explore a handful of specific contentions made by the Frankfurt School about anti-Semitism, and to examine the degree to which these contentions, in my opinion, help us to understand current events in the era of Donald Trump. The work of the critical theorists led them to assert, first of all, that anti-Semitism rests not on actions taken by Jews, but rather on the personal insecurity of the anti-Semite. Members of the Institute of Social Research, the institutional context within which the Frankfurt School developed, hypothesized that this insecurity is often a result of frustration, and anti-Semitism is its compensatory aggression. The anti-Semite projects his psychology onto his victim, members of the Institute said to us, and succeeds in representing the victim as the aggressor. Anti-Semitism, from the perspective of the Frankfurt School, has far more to do with the needs of anti-Semites than with the behavior of Jews, individually or collectively. That is to say, critical theory's approach to anti-Semitism accents that this phenomenon may be better explained by the psychology of the perpetrators than by the actions of Jews. Certain of the lessons offered by critical theory were explicitly intended by them to apply not only to anti-Semitism, but also to racism and other forms of prejudice. Totalitarian anti-Semitism involved the discharge of anger on defenseless Jewish victims. In other contexts, the critical theorists were well aware altogether different peoples or races or ethnic groups could become comparable victims. Indeed, Horkheimer and Adorno underscore in a draft of a passage which ultimately appeared in a somewhat different form in the chapter on elements of anti-Semitism, a chapter in their co-authored book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, that, and I'm quoting them, depending on the constellation, the victims are interchangeable. Negroes, Mexican wrestling clubs, Jews, Protestants, Catholics. In contemporary America, I would underscore here, fears and insecurities of the kinds described by the critical theorists may very well help us to understand not only the rise of anti-Semitism, but also the victimization of, to take just one example, Mexican Americans. Another such point. Adorno and those theorists closest to him argued that modern anti-Semitism is, to a very large extent, a matter of conditioned reflexes rather than of aboriginal or spontaneous behaviors. Adorno, a core member of the Frankfurt School for many years, studied American fascist agitators, and he described the techniques which were used by these agitators in quite some detail. There's a very famous piece that he wrote that's entitled Anti-Semitism and Fascist Propaganda. It's based on a talk which Adorno delivered in mid-June of '44 at the Psychiatric Symposium on Anti-Semitism, which was held in San Francisco. Adorno noted the ways in which fascist agitators in the United States made use of unconscious mechanisms rather than ideas or arguments in their efforts to attract supporters. I think we're going to be hearing a lot about these matters from Jonathon Catlin in just a few minutes. So for the moment, just allow me to point out that Adorno stressed that concrete political ideas play a very minor role compared with the psychological stimuli applied to the audience by agitators. And Adorno accented three characteristics of the approach used by the American fascist propagandists of his era. The first was that the propagandists often engaged in personalization. They spoke about themselves and they identified themselves with those in their audiences. The second characteristic was that emphasis was placed on means, not on ends. The agitators whose works provided the data for Adorno rarely had anything concrete to say about the goals of their movement. The third and final characteristic noted by Adorno was that the propaganda of the American fascist anti-Semitic agitators functioned as some kind of wish fulfillment. That is to say, the audience was let in on a purported secret, often a scandalous secret, which allegedly explained a great deal. Anti-Semitic propaganda, Adorno pointed out, was not irrational. It was a calculated effect, consciously planned and organized. I haven't engaged in a sustained study of the rhetoric used by Donald Trump during or after his presidential campaign, but it appears to me to be the case that Trump has made use, quite likely altogether unknowingly, of certain of the techniques described by Adorno, including personalization and the de-emphasis of concrete policy proposals and goals. Trump's policy proposals, insofar as they exist, shift constantly. Sometimes he's an isolationist, sometimes he's in favor of bombing Syria or North Korea, etc. Unlike the agitators who were discussed by Adorno, Trump has directed his barbs not so much at Jews, but rather at Muslims and others. Tellingly, the techniques used by Trump, I would argue, have impacted negatively on Jews, even when Jews were not directly targeted. All present here are doubtless familiar with the rise of Richard Spencer and the alt-right. Some may also be aware that Spencer actually wrote his MA thesis at the University of Chicago on Adorno, though the university won't allow me to have access to it. And the question of what he got out of Adorno, that remains an unanswered question. But it's widely acknowledged that Trump's rhetoric has fanned the rise of Spencer and his ilk, and Trump has been unwilling to condemn his supporters on the hard right. Now, that's not to say that Donald Trump is consciously anti-Semitic. I very much doubt that he is, but he makes use of mechanisms and tropes and stereotypes which hearten or play into the hands of anti-Semites. Consider, for example, Trump's address at the Republican Jewish Coalition's presidential forum during his campaign for the presidency. "I'm a negotiator like you folks. We're negotiators," Trump said during his speech. Listen up for a second. Is there anybody that doesn't renegotiate deals in this room? This room negotiates them, perhaps more than any other room I've ever spoken in. Well, I think Trump thought he was being funny. I don't. A fourth point. The critical theorists argued in the mid and late 1940s that anti-Semitism had become part of a ticket. It was no longer a standalone ideology, but rather a plank and a platform alongside, amongst other things, an anti-union approach. When one accepted the platform, one tended to accept its components. So, as Fritz Pollock, Horkheimer's oldest friend and a key member of the Frankfurt School's inner circle once put it, anti-Semitism is not an isolated problem, but is something that's deeply interwoven with many other forms of attack on the democratic way. And from this, Pollock continued, we draw the conclusion that it can't be fought in an isolated way, but only as part and parcel of the fight against fascism and against any attack on labor. You know, we're currently living in a situation, leider, in which American democracy is under attack. The president and those in his circle have seen fit to engage in brutal criticism of the federal judiciary and of particular judges, of the press, of the American electoral process. Labor unions, long on the ropes, are on the verge of a body blow. Trump has said that he supports the so-called right to work laws, which, if implemented across the board, would basically mean the end of the union movement. In this context, the anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia of, for example, those who organized this summer's demonstration in Charlottesville, emboldened, I would argue, by Trump's victory, do in fact appear to be components of a ticket in which there are also anti-democratic and anti-labor planks. In Elements of Anti-Semitism, the critical theorists suggested that anti-Semitism has many roots, and these roots reinforce one another. One of these roots is religious Judeophobia, which has existed for millennia. Bourgeois anti-Semitism, Horkheimer and Adorno noted, scapegoats Jews for problems inherent in capitalism itself. Anti-Semitism is used as a way to conceal domination by a class, deflecting attention from that class to a Jewish subcategory. The final major television advertisement used by the Trump campaign was entitled Argument for America, and it was one in which Trump was heard proclaiming. This was the soundtrack. The establishment has trillions of dollars at stake in this election. Those who control the levers of power in Washington and the global special interests. They partner with these people who don't have your good in mind. It's a global power structure that's responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. And while Trump speaks, the video portion of the advertisement flashes images of four people: George Soros, Janet Yellen, Lloyd Blankfein, and last but by no means least, Hillary Clinton. Now, the ad doesn't explicitly label Soros and Yellen and Blankfein as Jews, and you know what? For a certain part of the attentive public, it didn't need to do so. The none too subtle, albeit subliminal message of the ad, which carried Trump over the threshold, was that Jews were responsible for the problems of America and that Clinton was in league with the Jews. Donald Trump, a self-proclaimed billionaire, won the election in part by successfully deflecting blame for the state of America from our economic system as a whole to those members of the bourgeoisie who are, in fact, Jewish. And he ends this ad, as I think he's obliged to do by law, by saying, "I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message." You know, the critical theorists weren't prophets, and they weren't infallible. Specific claims made by Horkheimer or by other members of the Institute with regard to anti-Semitism have subsequently proven to be wildly off base. In 1944, for example, Horkheimer very naively proclaimed the fact that he did not generally share blinders concerning the Soviet Union held by many other Marxist-influenced Western leftists. He said, "At present, the only country where there does not seem to be any kind of anti-Semitism is Russia." Well, this assertion was quite simply wrong. Serious questions have been raised about a number of the Frankfurt School's underlying assumptions and about its methodology. My friend Lars Rensman proclaims, and I agree, that the ideas of the critical theorists in re-anti-Semitism are in need today of supplementation and revision and actualization. But neither specific inaccurate predictions by the critical theorists nor methodological issues in certain of the studies with which they were involved should lead us to throw out the baby with the bathwater. There are, and I'm very close to finishing, it was the intent of this talk to demonstrate, insights in the writings of the Frankfurt School that may well help us not only to understand anti-Semitism as it existed in an earlier day, but to grapple with the phenomenon of 21st century American anti-Semitism. And the analysis of anti-Semitism provided by the critical theorists also sheds light on present-day racism and ethnic prejudice. For Horkheimer, the need to confront anti-Semitism after the Holocaust was intimately intertwined with his autobiography. We Jewish intellectuals who escaped death by torture under Hitler have only one task, Horkheimer wrote, to help see to it that such horrors never recur and are never forgotten. In solidarity with those who died under unspeakable torments, our thought, our work belongs to them. That we escaped by accident should make our solidarity with them not doubtful, but more certain. Horkheimer and those closest to him, in other words, were all too well aware that anti-Semitism wasn't dead. But if anti-Semitism hasn't died, neither has critical theory's approach to the study of it. And so I conclude. The reasons for the continued persistence of anti-Semitism and the means by which anti-Semites attract contemporary supporters may well be clarified by reconsidering works produced by those associated with the Institute of Social Research decades ago. And the approach of critical theory may also help us to understand not only present-day hatred of Jewry, but also present-day racism and ethnic prejudice. The constellation of forces that constitute the elements of anti-Semitism is unique. But some of the stars in that constellation are doubtless also in others. Thank you.
All right, my talk is called The Authoritarian Personality and Its Discontents. And I'm going to start with a quote from Max Horkheimer. "Whoever is not prepared to talk about capitalism should also remain silent about fascism." Max Horkheimer, the longest-serving director of the Frankfurt School, penned these infamous words from exile in New York City in the ominous year of 1939. The essay this line appears in, "The Jews in Europe," is controversial for trafficking in dubious stereotypes about Jews in capital, but nevertheless, this pithy line captures the currency of the Frankfurt School's thinking for our political moment. Just last week, the political theorist Corey Robin reprised Horkheimer's dictum for our times, tweeting, quote, whoever is not prepared to talk about Bushism should also remain silent about Trumpism. Another recent reprise suggests the inextricability of climate change and the capitalist imperative for endless economic growth. Quote, whoever is not prepared to talk about capitalism should also remain silent about the sixth mass extinction. The most defining feature of the Frankfurt School's analysis of fascism is their emphasis on such historical continuities. Instead of seeing fascism as an alien phenomenon that attacked liberal democracy from without, they tried to identify elements of fascism that also flourished both before and after fascism under liberal democracy. What many in 1933, as in 2016, saw as a fascist revolution and a rupture in political culture, the first generation critical theorists saw rather as the outbreak of existing fascistic and authoritarian tendencies already pushing liberal democracy to its breaking point. This context explains, I think, why the theorists in exile in America saw what they called totalitarian capitalism, employing the ideology of consumerism much the way Goebbels employed the ideology of the German folk. In fact, they considered such ideology more insidious in the US because it operated under the surface, though its aims were the same: to manufacture consent by way of mass distraction and collective hypnosis by way of mass media. Having fled Nazi Germany themselves, this seemed reasonably enough to them like a precursor to American homemade fascism. I want to focus here on a few prominent historical continuities the Frankfurt School noted between fascism and the forms of liberal democracy that have historically paved the way for it. In particular, two aspects of modern social experience played a crucial role in their narrative about the emergence of fascism in the first place. The first I've already mentioned, the structural inequalities produced and exacerbated by what Adorno and Horkheimer already called in the late 1940s late capitalism. I don't know what we're in now. For Horkheimer, what is it?
Too late capitalism.
Yeah. For Horkheimer, fascism only hardened existing inequalities into absolute ones, even if the social other changed from the caste of what Marx called the reserve army of subsistence laborers to social types familiar today: the Jew, the Muslim, the foreigner. The second phenomenon is the authoritarian personality, my focus here. The Frankfurt School began to turn to Freudian psychology in the 1930s in order to explain why the suffering working classes, instead of achieving their revolutionary potential, were instead won over by fascism. And one of their answers was that mass psychology had been employed to turn workers against their own interests. The term authoritarian personality was popularized by Adorno's co-authored sociological work published by that name in 1950. And I would define the term as a historically produced character type characterized by the inability to experience, and hence the inability for autonomous moral, political, and aesthetic judgments. This character type should be seen as a broad sociological heuristic. It does not map on to an individual's actual political practices or beliefs, but rather describes, in the author's words, the potentially fascistic individual, the qualities of which the authors measured with what they called the F scale, where F stands for fascist, along several dimensions: submissiveness, adherence to social convention, aggression, superstition, a rejection of inwardness, repressed or paranoid sexuality, projection, and anti-intellectualism. Before the 2016 election, the authoritarian personality had quite a bad rap. It's long been cited rather superficially as a theoretical support for arguments about human nature like those demonstrated in the famous Milgram experiments, which aim to show authoritarian individuals as mere cogs in a bureaucratic machine. Adorno co-authored The Authoritarian Personality with several psychologists, and many of those contributors came to the rather simplistic conclusions that individuals to whom fascism appeals are merely bad apples, discrete pathological cases that arise innately or as a result of authoritarian parenting. Adorno notes many problems with these psychological conclusions in his own contribution to the book. First, they assume an unchanging Freudian subject throughout history, and second, they thus distract us from how authoritarian subjects are socially produced by certain contingent historical arrangements. In this respect, Adorno offers something like a dissenting opinion in his own collective work. Rather, which I want to suggest here, as Peter Gordon has recently written, for Adorno, the authoritarian personality signifies not merely a type, but rather an emergent and generalized feature of modern society as such. Following Adorno's own critique, the task as I see it is to historicize the notion of the authoritarian personality, to emphasize how what Adorno called bad society in turn produces bad subjects, thus dooming the emancipatory potential of participatory mass politics. Viewing this work in light of the critique of late capitalist society that carries throughout Adorno's work, the concept of the authoritarian personality links together many spheres of analysis that were long considered distinct, namely the critique of capitalism, the critique of the culture industry, of nationalism, and of anti-Semitism. The most notable example is Adorno and Horkheimer's critique of the culture industry beginning in their 1944 Dialectic of Enlightenment, on which Liliane will speak more. The culture industry and the advent of mass media set the stage for one of the oldest cards in the authoritarian handbook, the cultivation of the heroic and celebrity status of the leader through the modern spectacle. The twin effects of the authoritarian personality and the culture industry add up to what Horkheimer and Adorno called mass deception, a category that invites us to see how, in 1933, as in 2016, the sensation of spectacle won over what Adorno saw as a society of hollowed-out subjects. Autonomy was not stolen by the might of dictators, but willfully sacrificed in the name of an imagined collective represented by a strong man promising national redemption. As Alex Ross put it in his New Yorker article, which gives the name of this panel, our present combination of economic inequality and pop culture frivolity is precisely the scenario Adorno and others had in mind: mass distraction masking elite domination. Like it or not, Trump is as much a pop culture phenomenon as he is a political one. Adorno wrote in a 1951 essay on the Freudian mass psychology of fascist propaganda, quote, "It is the bond of the collective that enables the fascist demagogue to win support of millions of people for aims largely incompatible with their own rational self-interest. Hence Trump's claim, now famous in January 2016, that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and wouldn't lose any voters." Yet Adorno dialectically interrelates this mass psychology with a deeper social critique. Quote, "The deeper we go into the psychological genesis of the totalitarian character, the less we are content to explain it as an exclusively psychological phenomenon, and the more we realize that its psychological stiffness is a means of adaptation to a mutilated society." The crucial hinge in Ross's claim that the Frankfurt School knew Trump was coming is that the theorists were not thinking only of Nazi Germany when they investigated the fascistic potential of modern society. The psychological data for the authoritarian personality came from the US, which during the 1930s and 40s produced its own share of nationalist populism, albeit with less drastic consequences. One of the key theses of this work that carried across the Atlantic was that the authoritarian subjects who came to define themselves identify themselves with fascism, define themselves negatively through a negative relation to outgroups such as Jews, foreigners, and communists. As Adorno put it, authoritarian subjects fall, as it were, negatively in love with the outgroup enemies they construct. He crystallized this position: we are categorically and absolutely not them. What Adorno thus called negative integration generates an in-group without an affirmative content, without a necessary one. The centrality of racial others in the formulation of American political identity throughout American history obviously has a very long tradition, but this was radicalized by mass media and new propaganda techniques in the 1940s. An equally important analysis of authoritarian populism in America comes from Leo Lowenthal, a less-known sociologist affiliated with the Frankfurt School since its founding. Lowenthal's 1949 book, Prophets of Deceit, is a sort of psychological ethnography of the populist agitators like Father Charles Coughlin, who mobilized huge crowds across America through xenophobia, Judeophobia, and paranoid anxieties about a secret but imminent capitalist and communist plot on America. The authors analyze speeches by agitators that sharply recall the populist rhetoric of the 2016 election. As they personify such leaders, quote, "We are coming to the crossroads where we must decide whether we are going to preserve law and order and decency, or whether we are going to be sold down the river to these red traitors who are undermining America." Adorno and Lowenthal's accounts of mass agitation share several key factors. First, they both focus on the rally as a group setting in which the individual is allowed to throw off repressions of their unconscious instincts, to let loose. They emphasize how individuals eagerly sacrifice part of their individuality in order to be part of this imaginary new in-group. It's not forced, but willful. Lowenthal, in particular, explains persuasively how the agitator functions as a social therapist with what he calls an exogenous theory of disease, in which every pathological symptom in existing society can be traced to a foreign agent. Prophets of Deceit includes rich chapters on malaise, discontent, disenchantment, and resentment. For Lowenthal, following Max Weber, these feelings are consequences of the depersonalization and permanent insecurity of modern life. The agitator becomes a master of channeling this inchoate protest from an apparently isolated and purely psychic or spiritual crisis into collective outbursts of aggression. To quote from Lowenthal, instead of helping his followers to sublimate the original emotion, the agitator gives them permission to indulge in anticipatory fantasies in which they violently discharge those emotions against alleged enemies. Next, the thrill of breaking taboos, moving between the respectable and the forbidden, are also key to the agitator's power, as we also see today. Finally, both theorists argued that their followers don't have to believe in their leader. On some level, they know this entire experience to be phony. It seems beyond a doubt to me that many of these phenomena are at play in contemporary Western politics, and not just in America. But we're left with the question of how to counteract such agitation. Lowenthal and Adorno emphasize the rally as a participatory spectacle able to mobilize mass audience through in-group identification. Yet one question today is what becomes of power like Trump's, which was constituted by these means, once it is no longer subject to these mass rallies to sustain it. While Trump has thrown several rallies in office to sustain this base of supporters, his popularity outside that small in-group has plummeted. Hence, ultimately, the Frankfurt School's analysis of the authoritarian personality may be more helpful in explaining the rise of Trump in electoral politics than in telling us what to do next. I want to conclude with a cautionary note about using terms like fascism and authoritarian in the first place, and in doing so to note how much has changed in the nearly 12 months since the election. In the immediate aftermath of the election, millions of Americans were justifiably afraid and took to the streets in resistance. In this setting, the Yale Holocaust historian Timothy Snyder issued a timely and best-selling manifesto on tyranny for this movement, calling upon everyday Americans to resist, defend democratic institutions, never obey in advance, and to prepare for the worst, an American version of the Reichstag fire that Hitler used as a pretext to seize total power in Germany, suspending civil liberties and repressing leftist opposition. Yet with the critical distance of time, this catastrophism or crisis thinking has subsided, and we can now see Trump's relative lack of power since assuming office. The fact that despite having party control of all three branches of government, Trump has not been able to fulfill significant campaign promises. The historians Samuel Moyn and David Priestland thus compellingly argued in an August New York Times op-ed that Trump isn't a threat to our democracy, hysteria is. They argued that deploying alarmist terms like fascism and authoritarianism can actually distract us from long-term material, social and economic problems, which they call the real source of danger, which have been silently eroding our democracy long before the specific threat of Trump, notably accelerating income inequalities and accompanying status resentments. To respond to Trump with cries of resist tyranny is to miss the fact that Trump's election was also a rejection of the bipartisan neoliberal consensus that preceded it. These authors conclude with a gloss of 20th century history that seems to me in keeping with much of the Frankfurt School's own analysis. It's easier to believe that democracy is under siege than to acknowledge that democracy put Mr. Trump in power, and that only more economic fairness and solidarity can keep populists like him out. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not just going to talk, I'm going to show you something, because the members of the Frankfurt School were also observing and listening. And I would like to say two things. The title, "The Frankfurt School Knew That Trump Was Coming," leaves a lot of questions open. Who or what is the Frankfurt School? Jack was already indicating that individual members made glaringly, interestingly false predictions, and I can add a lot of others. For example, Max Horkheimer, in the middle of the revolution in Munich, after the end of World War I, writes home to his mother, the good rich boy, son of a factory owner, "Mom, everything is quiet, don't worry, there's nothing happening." 2 days later, he was incarcerated because he was mistaken for the revolutionary Ernst Toller. Things like this can happen, and I can quote many more. So the theory of the Frankfurt School may be something different than the protagonists who are voicing their opinions, and the theory is also not uniform. The second thing I want to say is actually it's much worse than it appears after listening to John and Jack, because it is not a question of an individual person who is in power, but a question of a system. The unavoidability is an unavoidability that we have to ask: if this particular person wouldn't be in power, would there be somebody else just like him, maybe not like him, but almost like him in power? May I ask you to dim the lights a little bit so that we can see things? I would like to begin with the general question that these two gentlemen have posed to members or non-members. We don't quite know how to deal with Mr. Krakauer to the right, about the current affairs in Germany and then in the United States. I chose two images that are both under glass. Mr. Adorno looking into the mirror. The glass in Krakauer's picture is already a little bit worse for the wear. That's the third person in a tuxedo, no less Max Horkheimer. And they ask the question of the fate of the Enlightenment in late capitalism. And once we can't escape late capitalism, we have to ask, is it this person, whose name I don't want to repeat all the time, in power right now, or is it the political system? And if we remember what it is about, first of all, the inheritance, the lessons that the Enlightenment have taught us. And one thing the Enlightenment has invented is something that we take casually as important and self-evident: the modern individual, the person who can think for himself without being the subject of a monarch, without being told by somebody how to think, who is an independent human being. And this is going to be questioned. I see we are staying with the slide, but that is quite okay. We start with, it is after all the Enlightenment who is with us. We have Mr. Krakauer first, who wrote a collection of essays. Why a collection of essays? He was a newspaperman. He wrote for the Frankfurter Zeitung, and so he collected this, The Mass Ornament, in which he was arguing the following. He looked first at the assembly line, a totally new invention, invented, of course, in the United States. We have here the Henry Ford motor car factory. If you are wondering, they are adding magnets to the wheels, something very important. In 1913, that's about the year where we imagine assembly work to be invented. And here you have them a little bit later. You can see a car is emerging. And just in case you think it's not just man, because if you look at the members of the Frankfurt School, it's mainly men, although Gretel Adorno is thought to have written or at least corrected part of the book as well. I just put it as an aside. You have here women working in a radio factory, putting together the object, the radio, the object that needs to be traded. And here you have another view of this. And what did Krakauer observe? Krakauer was looking for the individual that the Enlightenment has promised. And what he found is groups of people who had no authority over the objects that they have produced. It's called a division of labor. They are doing the magnets, they're putting down the wheels, they are putting little parts in the radio machine. They are part of a whole without what the Enlightenment promised, the authority over one's own thought and work. And this is now Krakauer looking at the Tiller girls, 1929, and he says, well, there is a relationship about putting the wheels on the car and putting the legs up. The legs may be nicer, okay, I can deal with this, but what is the same is the question of the group versus the individual. What you enjoy here is precisely the fact that they all look alike. They're dressed alike, they move alike. This is what the Tiller girls are, not just the Tiller girls, this is also the Hollywood Review of 1929, and also, of course, Busby Berkeley in 1933. And here it starts to get already a little bit dangerous when you remember that a certain person called Adolf Hitler loved Busby Berkeley and was actually in quite a dilemma. These were American movies. He was not supposed to like them, but he had a film studio in the basement of his home where he was watching these films, because that is precisely the erasure of the individual. But it is now the erasure of the individual not to produce a car or a radio, but to produce enjoyment and amusement, something we might call culture, maybe not with a K, but with a C, maybe not, well, we can talk about this, but here it is. And the Rockettes, this is now 42, still the same, you can still watch it, I think it's still there. And then he was watching movies, I'm still talking about Krakauer, and he thought, well, in the movies, something very strange is happening also. The movies becomes for Krakauer the absolute most advanced art form in which one can show the erasure of the individual towards what he calls the mass ornament, technology taking over. This is the city in Metropolis, but it's a city where you don't know whether it's entirely imagined or whether the illusion should also be taken out into reality, because those shop girls, as he writes, go to the movies to be distracted by looking at this, and they go out of the movie theater and they see out of the movie theater exactly the same, because that's what they want to see. And that is what work looks like in Metropolis. And you can see there is a single person here, not the assembly line, but that single person looks almost like part of the machine. And that is Metropolis from 1927, but you know that Charlie Chaplin, doing this movie in 1936, was watching movies before he did his own film. And then it becomes more interesting, because Leni Riefenstahl, when she did her movie of the Olympics in 1938, what was she interested in? Well, this kind of ornamental group picture, which is the Rockettes, except with Olympic medals. That is a wonderful thing to behold, except these are guys, I think. I'm sorry, guys have to be introduced too in this thing. And it's, of course, something that she isn't just observing, but that the Nazi machine has also put into action. Because here you have the Youth March of 1935. These are the political tiller girls of the year coming along, and the aesthetic pleasure that you get is now producing a knot in your stomach. How do I come from the assembly lines to the tiller girls to this? And for Krakauer, it is one story, the story of the move to an anti-enlightenment and the erasure of the individual, because I can do beautiful things as well. I don't have to kick up high heels, I can kick up Nazi flags in 1933. And if I look at the nighttime rally in Berlin in 1933, I know what I have learned from the movies. I can use the light, I can get the illusions up, and here I am not knowing where I am and what I'm doing. Here you have the spotlights in the Nazi rally in 1937, all learned from the movie, because I'm a little bit hesitant of saying that the Nazi rallies have given material for the movies. Now, when Adorno Horkheimer coined the word culture industry in the dialectic of the Enlightenment, they coin it in contrast to a term they discussed first, mass culture. Mass culture was a term that is related to the term of the mass ornament, to the term of the masses in general, that were, after all, the sign of modernity. In the early 20th century, whether you look at Elias Canetti or Hermann Broch or any theorist, you find the observation, the thinking about the masses. But why did they reject mass culture? Because the step, let's say, away from Krakauer, or thinking about him in a different way, was to point at the political direction. Mass culture for Adorno and Horkheimer would have meant something from below. They write something like folk art, something that the masses decide to do something. But as a matter of fact, the masses in late capitalism have no means to decide anything anymore. They are decided upon. So if we start with the erasure of the individual and the body that is no longer a thinking body, we have now somebody or a group, no longer individual, the masses, that are dealt with from above. And that is what the dialectic of the Enlightenment is trying to do. And this is what now Adorno and Horkheimer had looked at. They look at Hollywood, and here you see Grauman's theater at a movie premiere, and it is very, very difficult to find out what the difference is between illusion and reality, what the difference is between a culture that should educate and a culture that should simply amuse, between the leveling of the high art and the low art. And for Adorno and Horkheimer, there is no more high art, and there is actually no more low art either, and both have lost the important touch, because high art was supposed to be serious, they are Germans after all, but low art was supposed to be rebellious. This is not rebellious, this is just following the illusion of her husband's affair. Oh, how wonderful. Here we have it. Another thing that I wanted to listen to, and now I'm very cautious in doing this because you might leave the room, and we are not proceeding yet with our discussion, is the music part. Adorno was, of course, a musician. His first career was a composer. He studied in Vienna. He studied music. What he really minded is the industrial fabrication of music. I have here, you can copy the HTTPS address, very good elevator music. But you know elevator music and music. You can just close your eye and listen in your mind on this. And you know precisely what he meant. Mass-produced, where you don't even know who the hell is the composer of this. I actually also wanted to show you a clip of the comedian harmonists, simply because they are the Tiller girls of the music, but we leave that aside. The problem that we all have now, and that's in the category, was Adorno right or wrong, is the question of jazz. Because for Adorno, jazz was part of this constructed music that was senseless and of late capitalism. Another point of criticism was the radio. The person to the left with his arms up is the young Orson Welles, still slim. Look at him. He will be not that size after 1938. And Adorno was extremely upset with the radio, and he compares the radio with the telephone. He says in a telephone still, you have a voice who's responding to a voice. You have a conversation. In the radio, you have something that is producing sound, and you are just passively receiving and listening. And that, of course, is the high point of decadence in late capitalism. I had to go to the site of the early television museum in Hillard, Ohio, to show you about what he may have seen, namely television as well as something that is, I don't know whether this is an American word, please correct me, stupidifying people, because they are just sitting there, and Andy... It's okay. Okay. If Andy says, okay, I'm going with this. Thank you, Andy. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. I was selected on this panel because I'm from Frankfurt, just to, so this is the translation. And this is, of course, where we end up. This is, in some ways, too good to be true. You have a person in the right place at the right time, except it isn't the right time, because if we follow Adorno and Horkheimer seriously and with great attention, the right time was supposed to have happened a long time ago, about the time of the McCarthy witch hunt and so on. I just want to end with these new innovations that Adorno and Horkheimer did not know about yet, and that are kind of multiplying and complicating what they said about radio and television. And this is what we have to live with, and these are the floodgates. So in other words, we have a problem that is systemic. I put this down. I hate this already because these are, whatever. But here you have what they mean. Thank you very much.
First, I want to thank our panelists for these really extraordinary talks, very stimulating and insightful. And I really don't have much to add, but I do want to talk about something else in a moment. But before I do that, let me raise some questions that have already been, I think, anticipated in the talks. One is, as you already know and was mentioned by John, the title of this evening's discussion is borrowed from a column written by Alex Ross in the December 5th, 2016 New Yorker. But it wasn't the first time that Ross invoked the Frankfurt School. He wrote 2 years earlier that if Adorno were to look upon the cultural landscape of the 21st century, he might take grim satisfaction in seeing his fondest fears realized. And we could say, I think, with some degree, or let me put it this way, I think the panelists might agree, that this is somewhat overstated, that we have to think about the ways in which the Frankfurt School didn't anticipate Trump, or what elements of Trumpism, if we can talk about Trumpismus or something like that, were not identified by the Frankfurt School. Let me also mention that it seems to me that there are some questions implicit in all of the talks that might go under the category not just how Trump was not anticipated by the Frankfurt School, but to what extent was the Frankfurt School mistaken, or not mistaken, but was their analysis somewhat misplaced? I just raise a few examples. The notion that Jack Jacobs mentioned, that victims are interchangeable. Are they really interchangeable? Are the Jews really interchangeable with other ethnic groups? I just raise that as a problem. Also, the idea that political ideas are unimportant. Is that really true of contemporary Trumpism? I mean, Trump himself is, pardon the expression, not an intellectual. You may have noticed this. But there are people in the Trump camp, like Stephen Bannon and others, who are intellectuals of sorts, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And so one has to, and also, was it not a misreading of the intellectual content of fascism in the 1930s that led them to that perception that that there is no intellectual content to fascism? Is the fascism just psychological projection? I also want to mention something that just occurred to me in listening to Liliane's very interesting and entertaining talk about work, or the modalities of regimented labor. Isn't it true, or isn't it an interesting change in the perception of work, that the work that is most longed for and nostalgically invoked by Trump's supporters is the work that Liliane showed us, the assembly line, the Taylorist factory, the Fordist factory. Today, if you look at the ways that work is represented in the handbooks and manuals and newspapers concerned with work, it's not regimented work that is being, that they're looking forward to, or that they're identifying as the nature of work, but they talk about the communicative workplace, the democratic workplace, the educated workplace. These are configurations and representations of work that indicate that there's been a change in the nature and in the perception of work, and this leaves people behind who are still of the generation that could look backwards towards regimented Taylorist labor. Has work not changed, and has not the reality and the perception of work not changed, and doesn't Trump and his acolytes exploit this change? Now let me talk about something else that hasn't been mentioned. It's a kind of a grim subject, but you might think that we could have had a different title. Not the Frankfurt School knew Trump was coming, but something like, why is the alt-right so obsessed with the Frankfurt School and critical theory? For some time now, the alt-right has been talking and ringing the alarm and warning that cultural Marxism, or the Frankfurt School, which they identify by name, is in the ascendancy in the family, in the government, in universities, in political correctness, in other words, everywhere. In fact, there is a website called Smash Cultural Marxism. And I quote from this website: "Cultural Marxist ideas have gone on to expand even further than what members of the Frankfurt School could ever have hoped for. So much so that people push these ideas, Frankfurt School ideas, push these ideas, never having heard the term cultural Marxism and not knowing what it is or where it originates from and from whom, and they are cultural Marxists nonetheless. This is the refrain of Paul Gottfried, the eminence grise of the alt-right, and sometimes credited with having coined the term alt-right, and to be fair, Gottfried knows something about critical theory because he studied with Herbert Marcuse at Yale in the early 1960s. And his disciple, Richard Spencer, and this has already been mentioned, Jack, you mentioned this, Richard Spencer, the leading alt-right thinker, has some knowledge of the Frankfurt School, tortured knowledge of the Frankfurt School, and Jack is quite right. Nobody has seen his MA thesis on Adorno and Wagner, but purportedly what he wrote was that Adorno came to admire Wagner, and he came to admire Wagner's anti-Semitism, so that that Spencer concludes that if a Jew like Adorno could appreciate Wagner's anti-Semitism, there might be something to it. In his 2011 book, Righteous Indignation, Excuse Me While I Save the World, Andrew Breitbart, or the late Andrew Breitbart, wrote that the Frankfurt School imported the strategy of using the social sciences to tear down the social fabric into mainstream America. He also didn't miss the opportunity to point out that the members of the Frankfurt School who want to tear down the social fabric were Jews. So today, the assault on cultural Marxism, and this phrase, cultural Marxism, is ubiquitous, is all over Breitbart News, and a constant theme even among white supremacists. And my question is, maybe we can discuss this as well, how do we explain this preoccupation with the Frankfurt School on the right? Is it merely an updated anti-Semitism, the protocols of the elders of Frankfurt? Or is there another possible answer which has been suggested by Andreas Hüssen, who wrote, looking into the mirror of critical theory and its analysis of race hatred and media domination, the white supremacists recognize themselves and their history. But in order to preserve their righteous indignation, an indignation based on pathologically conspiratorial thought, they had to make critical theory into a primary intellectual enemy and a scapegoat. So maybe we can have, first of all, response from the panelists, and then we'll open it up to you guys.
I hear there's another mic here someplace. I'm going to look for it. Thank you, Andy, and my thanks to my fellow panelists. Really, really briefly, I'd like to say a word or two, perhaps in response to each of you, if I could. First of all, Jonathan, I thought that your talk was genuinely interesting, but I disagree with part of your political assessment. And in particular, I disagree with what you referred to as Trump's lack of power since taking office. I don't think that's right. I think that Trump has already had a disastrous impact on the environment via the damage he did to the Paris Accords. I think he's had an impact on the United States Supreme Court and thereby on our entire judiciary. I think he's had a disastrous impact on women's rights, on access to birth control and to abortions, amongst other things. And taken together, I would say that far from manifesting a lack of power, he has actually done a great deal, which I believe to be deeply harmful. And to Liliane, I would say, I agree with you that it's not a matter of an individual, but rather a matter of a power system, so to speak. And that I was focusing on Trump because we had 15 minutes. But my references to, amongst other things, Richard Spencer and to Charlottesville and any number of other such things I could have mentioned were meant to suggest that what we're dealing with here is not a matter of one person who came to power, but of a series of dynamics that have been set in motion. And finally, Andy, if I could, I think that you raised two questions which are really genuinely interesting. First of all, on the question of whether, no, I'm serious. I'm 100% serious. I've known Andy for many, many, many years, and he's consistently interesting and has profoundly important things to say. I'm 100% serious. You asked the question about whether victims are interchangeable. And my response goes something like this. The first thing is to understand what it is that the Frankfurt School meant. They're not saying that anti-Semitism is interchangeable with Islamophobia or anti-black racism. In fact, they go out of their way to talk about the unique constellation that constitutes anti-Semitism. What they are saying is that people who are victims in other contexts could also be murderers. And in fact, that's the very next sentence in the Dialectic of Enlightenment after the one from which I was quoting. And that's a sad reality. I don't have to, I think, underscore that too heavily. Jews were victims in 1944. They have not consistently been victims in subsequent decades. And how do we explain the preoccupation? How do we explain the preoccupation with the Frankfurt School? As you know, even better than I, Andy has written a great deal about the Frankfurt School over the years. We're talking about false projection. And the Frankfurt School, in any number of different works, used the term false projection in order to explain precisely the phenomenon that you were alluding to.
I can respond after.
Oh, okay. Annie, I would like to respond to 2 points that you have made. One, the question why the Frankfurt School is appearing in all these writings. I don't think, actually, that these people are reading it carefully. I'm sorry. And we cannot check it because, as Jack has pointed out, some work is not available for us to read. But the suspicion is strong. The suspicion is strong, so it becomes a war term, a branded issue. So the question is maybe a different one. Why don't we say Marx, Engels anymore, but the Frankfurt School? Is that in a way to show that you are more up to date? You have other people, you don't have to go back because those, I don't know, Russians or whoever have taken the Marx Engels bit already, so now we need somebody else, you know. So we can go into that direction. The other point I thought was very exciting, what you said about the nostalgia for the assembly line, and the nostalgia for the coal miners, and the nostalgia for the old energy. This was like in the early 20th century when you had the nostalgia for the arts and crafts. Now you have the nostalgia, it's a little bit perverse, but we can live with this. So I wonder what time we are in now. When the question arose, are we still in late capitalism? You said late capitalism.
Too late.
Too late capitalism. Well, how do we understand too late capitalism? While you were speaking, I suddenly had the vision of these wonderful computer labs that are taking place in really interesting social rooms like garages, where people sit in the screen and they don't communicate with each other, but with the screen. They are not particularly social. And where even things that were almost natural as social encounters like dating are now a matter of course, done by the internet. So, and not only done by the internet, the New York Times marriage page, I don't know whether you read them, I love to read them. It's on Sunday. You've noticed that on the bottom, they now say who introduced you, whether it is coffee and bagel or matchmaking. You know, it's like an advertisement of sort, but it becomes legitimate. What is that now? That's a different art of communication. It's different from the assembly line, but it's not the Enlightenment either.
I guess to first respond to Jack, so the line about Trump, you know, having limited power is, I think, important to note. It's not that he hasn't done damage. It's that authoritarianism or tyranny or fascism might be the wrong categories with which to be thinking about how to respond. And I think maybe that wasn't an important response to have. And obviously the testament to that are things like the Women's March, like very powerful moments in American history. But I think we're now in a very different moment where, you know, the political stagnation is in a different situation. And I think the sort of public intellectual consensus has caught up with this, that a lot of people now are no longer using the fascism terminology. And that's probably a good thing. As Liliane was saying, we've kind of realized that Trump is not specifically the problem. You know, the fact that this is still happening in many countries now in Western Europe would indicate that it's not just an American problem. It's not just an infatuation, as many Europeans might want to say, of American celebrity culture. This is a deeper socio-political problem that has been happening for a long time. The second point was about Andy's bringing up this, it's not only an affinity with the alt-right, but there was actually a White House memo that circulated. And there's some evidence that Trump was at least... Higgins, someone on the National Security Council, who believes this argument, who believes that cultural Marxism has introduced political correctness, starting with Marcuse and starting with the student movement in the 60s, and that it's basically an anti-white, anti-American conspiracy that is being fostered and propagated in academia, which goes, again, with their specific kind of anti-intellectualism. Another little note about this is that I actually do have some intel on that thesis. I know who supervised it at UChicago. And I know that it got a B+. And got Richard Spencer into graduate school to study with Paul Gottfried.
You call this insider trading, which is happening here. That's okay.
And I heard it was a generous B+.
Yeah. So the thesis is wrong. It might even be worth saying that we know very little about what Spencer actually said in the thesis, because the university really has refused to release it. But if what he said was that Adorno manifested a sympathy for Wagner, and that this led him to a sympathy for Wagner's anti-Semitism, no, in fact, on the contrary, in Adorno's writings on Wagner, he's very explicitly, harshly critical of Wagner's views on anti-Semitism. So I would probably have to give it lower than a B+.
I would say a D.
A D might do it, yeah. Though I haven't read it yet, you see, so I'm going to reserve judgment there.
I want to say something about Liliane's question, two questions. One, why not Marx and Engels? Well, you're right, Marx and Engels are considered to be historically irrelevant because communism has failed and is no longer the enemy. And what has survived in Marxism from communism is cultural Marxism. And the cultural interpretation of society is identified with the Frankfurt School. And the fact that they've taken this to be their mantra is very interesting. I mean, it's, in a way, it's turning the Frankfurt School against the Frankfurt School.
And it's, if I may add, Andy, it's interesting out of many reasons, not just about what we might call the update, Marx-Engels exchange for the Frankfurt School, but also, despite it all, a validation of culture.
I also want to say something about digital work. The digital workplace, you're right, is no utopia, but it is different from regimented labor. It requires educated, intelligent, quick-witted workers who can adjust to rapid changes in the digital environment. This is what happens in automated factories. There are fewer workers, but they have to be very adept and adroit.
But, if I may add something here too, it poses maybe even more radically the question of the human being and of humanity. Because if you think about the work on artificial intelligence and so on down there, this is pushing in yet another direction.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'll just plug my new book, The Eclipse of the Utopias of Labor, which is due out in a couple of weeks.
Andy, that might be
You all heard that?
a good segue to take some questions from the audience. We have about 15 minutes left. So do you want to call on someone?
Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned Father Cogswell, but what about the fact that the fear of Marxism drove Pius XI and Pius XII into kind of a relationship with the fascists, with the Lateran Treaty, the Concordat, the fact that this overwhelmed them, and this played into the whole anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church and its position during those years?
I mean, one thing that they actually mentioned, as Jack was saying, that these categories are all really interchangeable depending on who is the agitator, who's at work. So, right, Catholics, Protestants, like anyone can be the purveyor of this, populist agenda, but also the recipient.
Yes, there, the white shirt.
So I have a question. It follows nicely on this interchange because it's about populism. One of the most insightful interpretations of Trumpism that I've ever read. So I have a question that follows nicely on this because it concerns populism. One of the most insightful books that I've read about Trump and Trumpism is actually Jan Vennemüller's book, What is Populism? And so, which also sees populism of this sort as something that's always latently possible within liberal democracy because it grows out of the idea of popular sovereignty. And so what I'm curious about is whether there's any discussion of populism within the writings of the Frankfurt School, or if you think that there are any insight to be gained about populism from the writings of the Frankfurt School.
I mean, the reductive line that's normally told about the Frankfurt School is that they were elitist and that they didn't believe in the kind of radical popular democracy that something like populism represents. Adorno in particular hated crowds, he hated protests. He was not individually involved in mass politics. I think, if we see the Frankfurt School tradition moving forward into someone like Habermas, there's a way that the Frankfurt School could inspire a kind of democratic theory that both is responsive to the needs of a people, is genuinely democratic, but because of its, self-reflexivity is maybe the term Habermas would use, isn't subject to, for example, fascist agitation, the scapegoating of enemies. But it's an open question.
I would like to say something about that. Prophets of Deceit is a book about American populism. It's about the radio demagogues of the day. Gerald L.K. Smith was one of them. And it really does lay out what is, to my mind, very similar to Jan Wennermüller's book, some characteristics of populism. For example, the leader has no specific agenda for change. The leader is a cipher for resentment and fear. The leader is a kind of mouthpiece and a megaphone of resentment. For example, and by the way, I think that the most populist moment in Trump's ascent was when he said, "I am your mouthpiece, and only I can fix it." Those are populist tropes, clear populist tropes. But there are differences. Nowadays, Trump doesn't rail against predatory capitalism because he is a predatory capitalist. He rails against international trade agreements. He's an America firster, but Gerald L.K. Smith had a newspaper called America First. So there is a clear analysis of populism and prophets of deceit. It's even mentioned once or twice as a term. But there's no systematic analysis of the phenomenon. This is
and it's purely negative, which I think is a genuine question today, whether there can be left-wing populism.
right. Yes, sir.
How common is it for universities in general and the University of Chicago in particular? How common is it for universities in general and the University of Chicago in particular to not release doctoral theses, and what excuse are they using for not releasing it?
Well, the first thing to clarify is this actually wasn't a doctoral thesis, it was an MA. It was an MA thesis, not that it changes anything. It's not very common at all. In fact, it's extremely, extremely rare. Virtually every university in the country that I've ever had contact with was part of an overarching system. At one point it was called UMI, where you could get copies of unpublished dissertations, or for that matter, master's essays that had been deposited with the library. The University of Chicago, at the time when knowledge of Spencer's essay became public, said that it wanted to rethink these issues, and they made allusions to privacy questions. I think that it was an embarrassment for them, but we'll wait and see.
And yet they're all for free speech, whatever that means.
Right.
Maybe someone further back, I think.
There's a hand up there. Yes.
Hi, I'd like to address, you hear all right?
No, microphone's not working.
Here? Okay, here? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I would like to address a couple of issues. One, the whole idea of populism. I mean, there is a long tradition of American populism that goes back to the early 19th century. It's probably to some extent related to the frontier mentality, but we have a lot of examples of what we did not have in the 19th century, however, were mass media. And that, of course, is where modern populism, I mean, of which Hitler made the best use, and Trump as well made the best use. That's where it differs from earlier forms of populism. But the kind of, rabble-rouser hero that we see throughout American history, I mean, that is nothing new. And Trump, albeit a capitalist, falls into that stream. I'd also like to say something about work. I don't know if people have read Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court and then seen the Will Rogers film of that. Mark Twain, of course, wrote his novel in 1889, and it is a promotion of capitalist methods. I mean, what the Connecticut Yankee brings to King Arthur's Court is the knowledge of capitalism, of capitalist methods, of factory methods, of course, based on the mills in Massachusetts that were the center of industrialism in the US. If you go, however, to Will Rogers' version of that, done in the 1930s, I think it's 1936, I'm not exactly sure of the date, you will see that it is a complete attack on capitalism. It is an attack on the assembly line. It is attack on the methods of capitalism. It provides the ruination, in fact, of the people of the court. So in a sense, he comes, whereas the Connecticut Yankee in the original, in Twain, comes to save Arthur's court from its backwardness and superstition. The modern, Will Rogers, Connecticut Yankee destroys. And so I thought it's just an interesting comparison of what has happened to this notion of efficiency in work, in at least, the kind of rebellious mentality of the 1930s, where you were looking at various forms of. Yeah. My question is, what do you think? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. My question is, what do you think there's a difference in the way in which, well, first of all, populism as a question, and then do you think there's a difference in the way in which factory work has appeared? I mean, you talk about the nostalgia, but the factory work has appeared since it was first introduced in the United States.
Well, I'll just say very briefly that factory work hasn't entirely disappeared. This is a myth. In fact, one of the realities is that work is coming back from overseas, plants that work in industry that was outsourced to China and other places in the 1990s and 2000s is now coming back because it's cheaper to use automated factories in the United States. The problem is that they don't employ that many people anymore. That's why they're coming back.
We have a question in the back here.
So a comment, hopefully you can expand on this. But I really like the question of why is the Frankfurt School talked about now, and I think the answer that it's just projection is wrong and just an oversimplification, because there's even people on the left that are critical of the Frankfurt School. Angela Nagel, who wrote a book about the alt-right, and Rick Perlstein, who's a Jewish guy who writes for the Baffler. He wrote a book about just the history of American conservatism. The most famous of one was Nixon Land. These are books about conservatism, but they're actually also books about how the left sort of lost its support among the white working class and among the youth, and it sort of points the finger of blame. It sort of explicitly names the Frankfurt School and the New Left. It doesn't use the term cultural Marxism because that's sort of too associated with the right, but it says, the Frankfurt School and the New Left are the reason white people don't vote for the left anymore. So, I mean, this is not, just something on the right. The left has said this too, and I think it's, the reason is that sort of Frankfurt School was the turn away from economics towards, the social sphere, away from materialism towards, discussions of the abstract of oppression and such.
Meaning that the focus on mass culture of the Frankfurt School turned off the working class supporters that they might have had they remained traditional Marxists?
The critique that I've heard is that, which is in this memo, I think is just simply wrong, unless you're talking about second or third generation Frankfurt School people like Angela Davis or someone. I don't see any way that one can trace what is now called contemporary identity politics to the work of the Frankfurt School. No. That seems to me the scapegoat.
I have kind of a shorter question. So Liliane, you talked about how social media produces a certain yada yada, but we see that Mark Zuckerberg is toying with a run of being president. I guess he's going around the country, and what kind of politics is bred by someone that has this sort of Foucault, everyone has to see what everyone's eating for dinner, what does he want to lead, and why does he want to lead, you think?
I feel you're addressing me.
Yeah, in a way, okay. If anybody.
In a way, well, let me start the response and you can then jump in. I don't know Mike Zuckerberg personally, so I don't know what his agenda is. And the question that I wanted to pose, or that I will pose now, is not the question in regard of an individual who wants to run, but the question in which politics and aesthetics merge in a structure of such domination of the masses. You find it in a very different way as a conclusion in an essay by Walter Benjamin, where he talks about the aestheticization of politics in contrast to the politicization of aesthetics. That means if I come from let's say an area where I'm not trained in political work, but in amusement or entertainment, what do I bring then to politics? Now, that is a much easier question to answer in regard to our current president, because that's what he was doing. I'm not quite sure to which extent Zuckerberg is involved in all of this, but he is certainly also involved in a lot of work that I wouldn't offhand count as political theory or policy making. I don't know.
Maybe one more question, and then we have a reception afterwards, so you're welcome to continue the conversation outside.
This is in direct, what you just said bears direct relationship with my question, I think, which goes back, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Which goes back to your equating the Rockettes with the marching German soldiers. And there is no connection there whatsoever, in my opinion, because the people who became Rockettes were individuals who fought like sons of guns to get jobs as dancers in the creative field.
Okay.
And if you're going to go that far, you could talk about perhaps.
Okay.
Also, let me just finish my sentence if I may. Also, incorrectly, church choirs, which may be an ambivalent, and the Pledge of Allegiance. You can't equate all people who get together being together for the same reason.
Okay, it was not about people going together, and I'm not Krakauer. Let me just put this. I was talking about the question of subsuming the individual in a group and going for the aesthetic vision of the ornament. You may disagree with Krakauer, not with me, that's a different issue. I wasn't talking about myself. But you may disagree with Krakauer, but I just wanted to show you where the ideas are coming from. And I wonder what you mean by Rockettes training to become dancers, but workers don't have to do any training? Sorry. And so that means they had no training. I think that is very much looking down to these workers. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you for your attention and your participation. Thanks to the panel.